didn't realize until I've just jumped on camera. I was just about to hop into bed. Just about to. Oh, that's rather a much nicer look. We could have red light disco. That would be far more pretty. Green. That's a green light. So just as you're tuning in, that actually isn't too bad. Let's go with some blue. No, I will flick the light around to an appropriate lighting setting and we will discuss this topic. So basically, I was just about to brush my teeth and head off to bed, and the guidance was to have a discussion around the truth around mental illness, trauma, and what takes place around the desperation for the pain to stop when you don't have the ability to heal that much fragmentation. Now, I was guided to watch a documentary on Netflix, an Eileen Warner serial killer documentary. Now, the interesting thing about that documentary is that it does speak into the elements of abuse that led to the destruction or the destroying of someone else's life. Now, I mean, you're more than welcome to go and watch that documentary. For me, I pulled many different pieces from it from the sound mind perspective. It helped me process some of my own elements of awareness, and it also provided a lot of insight. Now, I could dissect and explain the entire documentary and all of the different lenses and perspectives, but right now that's not the message. The message is actually around understanding how complex trauma creates mental illness and how complex trauma works in the fragmentation of mind and what mental illness is if you look at from the lens of consciousness. Now, I am not a doctor and I am not a psychologist. I am very much educated in consciousness, yet I will not claim to be a professional in this realm or reality. So please do always seek medical assistance or professional help. And spiritual healing is not always the pathway for everyone, and different levels of journey, different levels of trauma will provide different pathways at different points in time. So when we look at trauma, we need to understand that trauma on top of trauma, on top of trauma, on top of trauma creates complex trauma, fragmented trauma. Trauma in the form of perhaps you have experienced verbal abuse as a child. Then when you hit your early teens, you started experiencing sexual abuse. Then perhaps when you were in your mid-teens, you started experiencing physical and psychological abuse. Perhaps when you got older, you started getting spiritually abused and or financially abused. These different abuses or violations of sovereignty, traumas against one's own sovereign right to be safe in their own well-being, create fragmentation on top of fragmentation, which is complex trauma. So complex trauma is where you already have a wounding based on your emotional abuse, and then you have physical, and then you have sexual, and then you have all of these different perspectives of abuse that start to become muddled up in between each other. You don't actually, because how does one deal with it? How does one deal with trauma? They disassociate, they disconnect. So the connection or the circuitry system actually unplugs during a state of trauma so that the physical body and the human being doesn't feel the horrific act. So anyone who's experienced something that is traumatizing has stepped away from their being. So they have become disconnected, disassociated, unplugged from the essence of their life force. Now, why does this happen? That happens because if you're plugged into your life force and you experience some violent rape or extreme levels of emotional abuse, or for what happens for many children is that something happens and the threat of death, that threat, whatever the experience is so much that if you were in your body, you would die. It would cause you to have an aneurysm. It would cause you to have a seizure. It would cause you to physically overload your system with the energy that's inside the body, and the body would die from shock. So it is a protection mechanism. It is something that protects you from experiencing the pain that is being inflicted upon the individual. So when you disassociate, when you disconnect, when you lash out, when you fight back, when you have your fight, flight, freeze, survival responses, they were built on very real protection mechanisms, very real aspects of human survival that prevent the human being from having a circuitry overload and energetic system failure that they die. So if you understand that every trauma has a fragmentation and its own protection mechanism, and then you have another trauma, and then you have another trauma, and then you have another trauma, and they build on top of each other, what happens is you have multiple defaults, you have multiple protection mechanisms, and you start to become very confused about what created what. So if you've experienced quite a interesting life experience, such as myself, and you have had trauma from multiple parents, from multiple step parents, from people outside of the family, that you've experienced psychological, physical, emotional, sexual abuse in those early childhood memories of 0 to 7, the brain and the being, based on the 4-quadrant method of mental, spiritual, physical, and emotional, is already fractured through all of those realms. So there's such a disconnection from the ability to be in true self, in reality, because there's been so many protection mechanisms built just to stay alive, just to live. Now, with each trauma, the impact of the trauma, it's not that you become more used to trauma. It actually becomes more severe because you have more fragmentation that occurs, which is a further disconnection. So in that, when you have complex trauma, you have complex states of mental well-being. You have different manifestations of different expressions, whether that be hyperactive ADHD, whether that is that you are more of a OCD energy, whether you have the tendency to be a little bit of a perfectionist, if you have extremes in the form of bipolar, if you have schizophrenia. All of these things are manifestations of trauma. Every single one. Each one was a survival mechanism that was placed into an early childhood experience to cope with what took place. So when you have things like attention deficit disorder with perfectionism, with a level of swinging between moods, and all of the different other realms that come on top of it, you actually can't find the core fragmentation because there's multiple core woundings and distortions that take place. Now, for anyone that's seen this documentary, it talks about an early loss of abandonment from the mother, right? So that's the first core wound that they mention. Then she goes into being adopted by her grandparents, and there is abuse, and then there's neglect, and then there's rapes, and then there is alcohol addiction, and then there is right? So each of these wounds builds on top of each other. And if we don't have the capacity or are guided or shown love, one, how to look at what has happened, to process it, the brain starts to create loops. And so what happens is the trauma that sits inside the brain's neurology and in your molecular system, and your cells hold this trauma. Each trauma you can find in a location of your body. Each trauma you can find in different parts of your nervous system. They are physically stored. They're compartmentalized and packed away when you unplugged to survive. Now, that means that the brain holds all the memories. They don't disappear. You can't release a memory. You can't forget something. You can't dismantle or move on or heal from something until it's been processed. So the people that are holding mental illness and that are challenged with different things that are happening, it's because the brain has all of these little compartmentalized traumas. And what it does to survive is it starts to loop around them, and it starts to move in different forms so that it moves away from the synapses or the pathways that hold this information, which is where you have brain capacity, where you have an ability with neurological cognitive thinking, right? My cognitive thinking right now at 8:39 p.m., normally my bedtime, is quite low because I wouldn't normally be getting up, telling and having a conversation about this. So my cognition is at a lower capacity and ability. What happens when you're tired? When you're tired, your brain doesn't get it. It's not as smart. It doesn't know how to move through the loops. And so when you get tired, it accidentally hits trauma edges or spots, or what you might call triggers. And these things come up to be witnessed and observed, or they get activated by an outside experience where the neurology starts to recognize a similar environment that it has to go into a protection mechanism. So your brain has become very, very masterful at keeping you safe from your own traumas. But when you get tired, when you get fatigued, when you get coming off drugs, when you are overstimulated, when there is something in your outside environment that is basically changing your neurological survival patterning because it's not as strong or it hasn't stayed focused, it hits those areas of information. And that's where a protection mechanism or an episode could come up. Now, the episode is the information starting to surface, or what you might call trauma coming to be witnessed. So anyone who holds mental illness is not crazy. They experience craziness because they are unable to process the mental illness that has been created by the default protection mechanisms that is keeping them safe from their own trauma. So the wounding that sits there is what needs to be addressed. And this is where you need to become trauma informed. If you have complex trauma, if you have mental illness, if you have any mental illness, if you have paranoia, if you have anything along that scale of interpretation of being on the spectrum, you have trauma. And I can guarantee you it's probably quite complex, that it's not just emotional, that it's probably emotional, physical, sexual, past life, ethereal, that your brain does not become that distorted in its ability to use itself and to function in reality through sound mind if you are healthy in your internal reality. So what this provides for us is the awareness that mental illness would be healed if we recognize that we need to address each core trauma and fragmentation and guide the mind gently back into the point of experience using very specific techniques, because you do not want to re-trigger trauma. Now, a mental episode or a psychosis or a experience such as relapsing is a triggered re-traumatization. So that's what mental illness is. Now, I've watched mental illness my whole life. Now, some of you might have seen my recent video that realized I was in a spiritual psychosis for a period of time. I am of sound heart and sound mind. But I was not fully internally in that space, which is very hard for me to talk about, considering everything that I speak into and explaining around that my channels are of truth and that the vessel was clear and it has its complexities. But this understanding is that when a trauma is activated, when it is triggered, and when it comes up and the brain does not have tools, it does not have a safe environment, it does not have a support network, it doesn't have people that hold space, it doesn't have the kindness and the care to support, which is being trauma informed, this activation, what happens is the mental illness episode, because you can't suppress it once it's been triggered to be processed and moved through, which is where there might be moments of, say, sanity or wholeness, but until that trauma is fully processed, once it's been fully activated and a memory has surfaced, something from the subconscious mind where it's done the loop through the brain has gone straight through that pocket of information, you can't container it again because there's too much information that has come up in the mind, body, spirit, soul. It's all there. So what we need to understand is that when someone is going through a mental episode, that they don't necessarily need meds, they may, that what's happened is they've hit the core of a trauma of truth in their internal being, and they need to be walked through very gently, very carefully to get to the core belief, the core attachment, the core fragmentation, the core promise they made to themselves, because every single victim of an abusive experience makes a promise to themselves to either never feel it again, to make sure it never happens to anyone else, to ensure that they get some kind of justice, that they'll return to God, whatever it is. Every single victim will make a promise to themselves in the disconnection and the disassociated moment where the protection mechanism starts to run that needs to be addressed, because often that promise is not something that fits their now adult reality from the conscious adult mind or from the sane human being that has enough realization of reality to actually process it. So these areas of information all need to be accessed for the trauma to be completely processed, alchemized, and released. Now, when it's complex trauma, you can have a trauma at 3-year-old that's linked to a past life trauma that's linked to a source origin point split or fragmentation. And that's where someone like myself is helpful, because it's a quantum experience. You have to go back through linear time or forward through linear time. Either way, however you want to start, you have to go to the 3-year-old, then you have to go to the past life, then you have to go to the next point of fragmentation until you find the core origin point where you have the beliefs, the constructs of reality, the stuck emotions, the attachments, the implantations, the multidimensional infiltration that can happen based on the hole that happens in the psyche. The unplugging to protect has to be filled. It's filled with the dark agenda. So mental illness looks fucking crazy because you have the dark agenda that have a beautiful spirit that's had some kind of shock. They've protected themselves, unplugged themselves from God. The hole then gets filled with the darkness, the agenda, which starts to work through the individual. Now, we've all seen how this happens and we've all seen how different people hold this. Now, you can look at it when you walk down the streets and you see specific people muttering to themselves. There is demons and different satanic energies that have overridden the soul of that being. Because eventually, when you've had that much fragmentation, then addiction to deal with the pain, because all of this is protection from pain, protection from the hurt. And so the spiral happens because there's no safety to actually go into the pain and the hurt and process it. And so what this shows is that I'm just going to remove I don't know, whoever this is, because we don't want your vibration in our field. Thank you very much. Goodbye. So what happens is the holes, you can't have empty spaces in the universe or in consciousness. It's impossible. You cannot. So you clear a space, something new comes in. You heal something, creation comes in. That's why letting go allows you to rise. You're not rising, you're filling yourself with a higher vibrational experience. You're letting go of an old belief system to bring in a new focus of manifestation, right? So one thing is releasing and another thing is filling. The same thing happens with trauma. Is the whole, instead of releasing, you're unplugging yourself from your true self. You're unplugging yourself from source. You're unplugging yourself from love. Every time that, the last time that relationship, and you're like, I'm never going to put myself in a relationship that hurts me again. Unplug your heart. Okay, awesome. What goes into your heart? Something that is not of love, which is often satanic, right? So these are where the agenda and where the outside world start to penetrate the vessel and create the insanity or the crazy. The problem is that the human being that's experiencing it is experiencing both realities: the infiltration of thoughts, the dark agendas, the manipulation, the spiritual attack, as well as trying to process the trauma that's been activated, that they don't have the skills, tools, or abilities to be able to move through because they were never given them in the first place. And so what this means is that we require to witness this about mental illness. We need to require to witness this about our own wounding, and not to demonize it. It's not to make it wrong. It's that everywhere you have a disassociated or forgotten memory, something that is not you has filled you up. And this is what in my mystery school we talk about as the not self. You've got the ego self. People talk about the ego all the time. This is the not self. This is a body of information that has been placed inside of you every time you've hurt, contracted, and disconnected from God. This is things that have very intentionally, from non-creation, or what we might call the archon energies, or the dark matter consciousness, have placed that inside. So when you heal something, you need to always choose to reclaim something simultaneously. So when you let go of something, you need to call something back. It is a process and a cycle of sifting through what is not you to rediscover who you are. So if you were to clear a wound and you realize that there was all of this dark matter consciousness that is not you in your being based on something that happened when you were 2 years old, you clear the dark matter consciousness, but you have to call back the innocence, the purity, the divine child of the 2-year-old self to reintegrate into the body and plug back in what was disconnected from. So this is why my work is something that I truly believe and want to share with the entire universe. I was going to say the earth, but for some reason the universe came out. And that's the DAC process. That is this tool of going into the core wound and recalling everything back and doing a full circle to complete and alchemize into the present moment. Because we cannot heal these complex things if we're not given a linear pathway. Because what happens with mental illness, what happens with extreme fragmentation and complex trauma is you loop it. And that's what creates an experience like what I moved through, which was a level of witnessing myself in truth and simultaneously psychosis, because it was so complex. And there wasn't an easeful way or a safe place for me to go straight to the core and get to the understanding of that. And sometimes going straight to the core would be too traumatizing, which would re-traumatize and further fragment the being, where they actually become unrepairable. So if you re-traumatize trauma by trying to take someone into the depth of a trauma before they're ready, then you can completely disassociate. You can come completely disconnected from God. And that's what you would consider someone who is a lost soul. They become an NPC. They are empty. And it is very, very, very hard to bring someone from emptiness back to connection and communion. You may as well say they're of non-existence at that point. So what's there is to recognize that complex trauma requires core layers, adjusting. Now, for women, most of their extreme fragmentation sits in their root chakra. Not always, but a lot of it sits in the root chakra for a woman based on their experience. For men, a lot of their trauma actually sits in their heart chakra and also in their solar plexus. So where they get stored, sacral is the second location for woman. Now, where they get stored will give you an indication of how many core traumas do you have to go through to get to the final piece or the bottom, so that the loop of suffering, the default protection mechanisms, the trickery of the mind keeping you safe, can clear all the not self stuff so that insanity or mental illness is corrected and healed. A fragmented mind is an insane mind. A whole mind is a sound mind. There is very few sane human beings on this planet. The fragmentation that it sits within the brain can only be repaired by coming into enlightenment or complete unity consciousness. So even if you don't identify with having a mental illness, you have one. Because we are on different spectrums of this level of mental Maria Tetikianai, what would you call it? Like the spectrum of how much information. My computer's going to go flat. So understanding this around, let's grab a charger. Understanding that there is spectrums. There's extreme spectrums to trauma. There's extreme spectrums to psychosis. There's extreme spectrums to dyslexia. There's all different spectrums to autism. All of this happens, but every single human being, unless you are an enlightened, ascended master, you have it. So what this means is that you have wounds. Your wounds are the key to you finding your true self. If you can process your wounds, you can come into the totality of your wholeness. This is what heals what we call mental illness and suffering or pain of the human species. I feel that I'm pretty complete in the layers of information. I would also very much like to go to bed. And my preference, God, is to not do transmissions at 8:30 at night, because they are not the most easeful for my cognition. And what I would really, really, really like is for you to sit in how can you recognize your insane, fragmented mind, your separate mind, your ego mind, your not self, and start working towards finding a pathway of healing, a pathway of support, tools, compassion to actually look at what's sitting there, which is the pain and the suffering of the disconnection from oneself through a traumatic experience that has created a perception of reality that can be alchemized and transformed if you have the courage to look at it. There are supports, and I am very much open to supporting those that feel resonant. Until next time. Wow, there's some interesting comments. Probably why I don't do messages at this time, because most of the human species cannot receive this information because their bandwidth is this big. So for those of you that have little bandwidths, I witness you and see your limitation, and I send you love, and I know that it will expand when you're ready to step out of the illusion of yourself and to find something greater than you. I love you, I love you, I love you. Until next time, Adonai.